So we're moving now into a discussion of policies and benefits and what employers do to help low-wage workers. I was hoping that we could start first with you, Sophie, and what we might do is go from you to Sarah, and then Scott, and then finish up with Audrey. Okay.
I'll get started. So again, I'm Sophie Collier, and I work at the Pittsburgh University Center at Columbia. And I've been taking notes on my notes all morning, so excuse me if I have any jumpy sentences. I might be integrating some thoughts that I had throughout the day. So in most of my work, I use the supplemental poverty measure to evaluate the impacts of existing anti-poverty programs and policy proposals that target poverty and safety. The supplemental poverty measure has an improved measure of poverty that includes tax liabilities and credits and in-kind benefits and medical and child care expenses in the tabulation of household resources, and employs a regionally adjusted poverty threshold that accounts for variations in housing costs across the country. So the official, compared to the official poverty measure, which only accounts for pre-tax cash income and has a poverty line that is the same across the country, the SPM is a more effective tool to evaluate the impact of many anti-poverty programs because, except for Social Security, the largest benefits come through the tax system or provided in kind. As part of our work with the SPM, so I'm just going to say SPM for something about poverty benefits. We've estimated the poverty impacts of raising the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour. We decided to model this reform because the efficacy of the minimum wage as anti-poverty policy is often debated, but it is true that a lot of jobs in the United States cannot sustain as basic needs or keep a family above the poverty line. So we estimated what the poverty rate would be if the wage were higher. And from this analysis, we found that raising minimum wage, federal minimum wage again, to $15 an hour would put a significant dent in the poverty rate, but it's not a cure-all. There's still a large role for anti-poverty programs and policies that support low-wage workers, particularly during times of unemployment. And these policies could be reformed to further the impacts of the wage hike. Today, I'll discuss our simulation of the $15 wage hike. My results are preliminary, so just a note on that, as well as some other analyses we've conducted that concern this group, specifically a simulation of a guaranteed jobs program, and a close look that we took at Maine's driving the House's proposal to expand SNAP work requirements. So basically, I'll discuss our attempts to answer two questions. How effective might raising the federal wage to $15 be in terms of anti-poverty policy when you account for changes in benefits, taxes, and potential job loss, as measured under the SPM? And what's the role of the safety net and employment policy when minimum wages rise, as they are now in many regions and may eventually rise at the federal level? So I'll begin with the first question. The Fight for 15 campaign is in part driven by the belief that full-time workers in the United States should earn wages that keep them in poverty. There are also arguments that raising the minimum wage is an ineffective and poorly targeted anti-poverty policy that ends up hurting those it might aim to help, as we discussed this morning. Concerns regarding the benefit cliff also come up in discussing the minimum wage policy, and thought that the combined effect of benefit cuts and employment losses outweigh the poverty impact of the wage increase. Evaluating this concern using the official poverty measure is basically impossible because you're not accounting for in-kind benefits or taxes when you're determining the use of household resources under that measure. But the SPM, an improved measure, is a more appropriate tool for measuring these anti-poverty policy impacts of a minimum wage increase, as well as its interaction with tax credits and in-kind benefits. So we developed a micro simulation that estimated the net effect of the minimum wage increase on the poverty rate. We used the 2017 current population survey. So our model was designed basically to answer the question, what would the poverty rate have been in 2016 had the federal minimum wage been $15 in that year? So this is not future oriented, we're just looking at that year in particular. And I can really provide a lot of answers about our methods, but in a very quick summary, we took the 2017 CPS adjusted wages for workers affected by the minimum wage with a spillover range from $2 below the prevailing minimum wage to $17, so $2 above the new wage. Adjusted for a labor market response using the method outlined by the Congressional Budget Office, as we discussed this morning, and adjusted SNAP using the USDA's benefit calculator, and taxes using the National Bureau of NDER's tax simulator. So note that, again, the results I'm presenting are preliminary, and we're still reviewing our methods. But what we found, there's about, in that year, there would have been about 35 million people who have been directly affected by a wage hike. In future years, the number of people affected by a federal wage hike will fall because many states or localities are raising their wages on their own. In 2016, directly affected workers were much more likely to be in poverty than those that were not affected by the wage hike. Altogether, about 35% of directly affected workers were in poverty or near poverty, so under 150% of the poverty threshold, while about 7% of unaffected workers fell into the same group. And about 12% of directly affected workers lived in a household with SNAP, which was low by our estimate. And under our simulation, about 7 million people moved out of poverty with the wage hike. So it was a reduction in poverty by 2.2% went under that simulation. So it's not just workers, it's workers and anyone in their household. So that's why it's much higher. And that's a poverty impact pretty comparable to the ITC and about 2 times the size of the impact of SNAP. So again, the national poverty rate fell about 2.2 percentage points, and the poverty/near poverty rate fell by 4.4 percentage points. For workers, the poverty rate fell by 2.6 percentage points, and the poverty/near poverty rate by 5.7 percentage points. And again, preliminary, but these are preliminary. For those workers that remained in poverty, this was mainly a story of part-time work and partial year work, which is another area for programs and policies for low-wage workers to address, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But we drew some important conclusions, preliminary conclusions, from this simulation regarding the interaction between wage hike and other policies that affect low-wage workers. SNAP cuts and job loss did not cancel out the poverty impact of the wage increase, but its impact would be furthered if SNAP benefit eligibility was adjusted with the wage increase, as has actually been the case in New York State. So the income threshold was increased for SNAP eligibility as the wage was increased. So you're like the benefit cliff is not as much of an issue. There's still a cliff, but it's in movement. Adjustments to the ITC could also further its impact in a more targeted manner, directly benefiting those households that are with lower income. Another policy that also should be considered that would extend the impact of the wage hike would be the child tax credit. As it stands, many low-wage workers do not receive a full credit because it's not fully refundable at the bottom of the income distribution. So expanding full refundability is another way to extend the targeted policy. We will simulate changes to the CTC with the minimum wage simulation to see how this extends impacts for families with children. Now, on to the second question, what's the role of the safety net and employment policy when minimum wages rise? With and without statutory wage increases, low-wage workers experience spells of unemployment. And in response, the proposals for guaranteed jobs programs are also picking up a lot of steam. There are proposals, there's a bill right now in the House by from Representative Rokana, and then there are, in the Senate, a number of discussions of workplace. Last year, the Brussels State Journal published an issue that included a number of different anti-poverty policy proposals, and I worked with Chris Weimer at Columbia and Sarah Himmelman at Pitt to simulate the impact of those proposals. So they range. There was this child tax credit proposal, guaranteed jobs credit proposal, a number of different proposals, and across those proposals, the most effective in terms of poverty reductions for those affected by the policy was the guaranteed jobs program. So this is an interesting area of research for those interested in addressing potential job loss resulting from a minimum wage increase. And we're thinking now about how to integrate that into our simulation of the wage, right? The simulation of the wage. Another policy reform that could directly impact low-wage workers, particularly those experiencing spells of unemployment, is the proposal to expand SNAP work requirements the House's version of the Poverty Bill, which reauthorizes the SNAP program that was released this summer, would make periods of unemployment worse for low-wage workers who receive SNAP by limiting the time they are eligible for benefits. The House's version of the bill institutes work requirements for all SNAP recipients that are considered work capable, and this includes able-bodied adults through age 59 as opposed to 49 under current law, as well as those with dependents ages 6 and older. So this expansion is driven by this idea that work-capable adults are increasingly taking out benefits while working less. And given the potential impact of this claim, we decided to assess its validity using a CPS. And now that claim is, comes from a look at SNAP take-up using the QC data, but only at a point in time. So who's working right now and receiving benefits? It doesn't take a whole year view for understanding of workforce. So a workforce participation. So according to our analysis, concerns raised by proponents of strict work requirements for SNAP participants are unfounded. Recent trends among work-capable SNAP recipients do not indicate that increase in SNAP participation or a decrease in work effort. In fact, the majority of work-capable recipients participated in work at some point during the year, and those who didn't often live with a family member who did, or were enrolled in school, or caring for a family member. The analysis that informs the House's version of the bill was driven by this really myopic definition of workers as those who are currently working, and so many low-wage workers experience periods of unemployment and turn to the safety net at those times. When thinking about low-wage workers and benefits, we should be careful, or I will be careful to not make the same mistake. So that's a brief overview of some of the work that we've been doing that relates to benefits and policies that affect the lives of low-wage workers, with a particular focus on poverty. Overall, from our preliminary analysis, we found that a large minimum wage increase, such as $1 to $15 per hour, would make a large dent in the poverty rate, but its impact would be further with more targeted if it was complemented by reforms of tax credit and safety net programs like HTC, EITC, and SNAP. And innovative proposals like the guaranteed jobs program. Limitations on programs for workers are, as expected, more detrimental. So, thanks so much.
Hey, would you like to follow?
Sure. Yeah, that was really interesting. So my name again is Saurabh Bhargava, and I am a behavioral economist at Carnegie Mellon. And so I think following Sophie is I think her talk kind of complements some of the comments I'll make in the sense of I think she described a lot of the substantive kind of policy reforms that are under consideration at the federal and potentially the state level to help combat poverty. And a lot of my research has been looking at role that behavioral economics and psychology and insights from marketing and other social sciences play in reshaping kind of the administration and the design of some of these policies. And so I don't know where the slides are, but on slide 2, there's a...
I think everybody has a copy of the slides.
Okay. So if everyone could turn to slide 2. This beautiful picture. Bless you.
The mind.
Of the mind. This is Donald Trump's beautiful mind. So I think that like traditionally a lot of our policies have been shaped by this presumption that individuals were rational, and I think historically this idea of the rational actor maybe was really pushed forward during the war, and when scientists and researchers were thinking about how do we extract efficiencies from the manufacturing sector. And this was their basic kind of model of behavior that came out of neoclassical and economics and rational choice theory. And it's this idea that people know what they want, they have unbiased beliefs about the world, which they update with new information, and their behavior kind of reflects those desires and unbiased beliefs. So clearly an accurate picture reality. I think psychologists responded over the last several decades by pointing out that that what we want is really context dependent, that our beliefs can be systematically influenced by factors like recency and salience and the vividness of that information, and finally that behavior may not be optimal, even if people do have a well-defined set of kind of desires and beliefs, but they might reflect temptation, emotion, and attention, etc. So someone who's unemployed and is very desirous of a job may not search 30 hours a week due to discouragement or self-control issues or just the stress of unemployment. And so I think I see behavioral economics as, and kind of other related enterprises as merging these two perspectives of human behavior, and certainly there are a number of researchers that are working to see how those insights can help to inform how we should reshape certain policies, many of the ones that Sophie had mentioned. So I want to talk about three very broad, generic lessons that I see from behavioral economics for policy design, and this is going to draw on examples from my own research. So I apologize for the narcissism. But the first lesson is the importance of simplifying plan information. And again, after Sophie's detailed description of the intricacies of some of the requirements and the interrelatedness across programs, I think that alluded to the complexity that's involved in programs, particularly those targeting those at economic risk. And so I'll first talk about some research that I did in the context of the EITC a few years back. And so this was so a bit of background on the EITC. Like many social benefit programs, the EITC has a significant rate of eligible non-claimants. So in recent years, it was estimated to be about 25% of those eligible for the EITC, which is probably the largest means-transferred, means-tested cash transfer program in the U.S., failed to claim benefits that were worth on average 1 month's worth of income. So these weren't trivial. The economic perspective is that, well, take-up might be limited because these programs are stigmatizing, or the administrative enrollment costs are really high. I think intuition or the behavioral, I think behavioral economists get credit for a lot of just intuition. So I'm going to call this the behavioral perspective, is that low take-up might be due not because of stigma or administrative costs, but they might be due to these psychological frictions, like not being aware of eligibility, confusion about the size of benefits, hassle costs, this idea that small administrative hurdles have large effects on behavior across so many different domains, and aversion to program complexity. So if we turn to the next slide, and none of these are numbers, so I apologize. A colleague and I approached the IRS and the EITC office specifically about 8 years ago, and I proposed to them running a field experiment where we could test some of these underlying hypotheses as to why people were not claiming. Non-claiming for the EITC is one of their two main kind of strategic objectives as a policy institution. They really want people to claim. And so we did this pretty quickly. It took us about 1.5 years, I think, to get all of the approvals and to get the okay from the IRS and to get everyone on board. But essentially, they let us redesign tax claiming notices and worksheets and distribute them in randomized fashion to about 35,000 non-claimants in California. And so what we did was there were, I think, 12 different versions. I won't go through all of them, but they were designed strategically. These were mailed notices, claiming worksheets, and we also played around with the envelope. But these were designed, strategically redesigned to test some of these hypotheses as to why people are not claiming, such as stigma, Is it the administrative costs, or is it something that, as policymakers, we might want to correct, such as confusion or lack of awareness about eligibility? And so on the next page, and I should say that this was targeting tax filers who did not subsequently claim the credit. So they could, the existing channel through which they could claim their credit is that they would be sent this fairly complicated and dense notice that you see in the next slide. You would certainly believe it's from the IRS from the way it was laid out, but it essentially summarizes the program. It gives a description of the notice. The language is a little bit menacing. It's very exclusionary. Don't return this if this, unless this condition is not. So it's this 2-page dense notice, and then it's followed with a short worksheet. And that's typically what was sent out to these non-claimants. And the base rate of response was 17% in the context of our experiment. And so on the next page, I'll just highlight a few of the interventions that we tested specifically to get at this hypothesis of the role of complexity, the adverse role of complexity in something as simple as taking up credit that's on average $500 and up to $5,000. And so we redesigned, I redesigned all of these in my apartment at the time. So it was really remarkable access, I think, to, oh, sorry, is that the owl?
No, it's Jean calling us. I don't know who Jean is. Just ignore her.
There we go.
I probably see here.
It's the EITC.
No, it's the IRS.
Extensions are not due till October, so yeah, I'm okay. But so the first thing that we did was we simplified this. The IRS's beautiful 2-page comic read-through with just a very simple document. And we tried to, our argument was that we preserved all the information. So all of the relevant information on these 2 pages was now in this clean 1 page. And it's just easier to read. And this wasn't done by any marketing firm or anything. Although I was editor of my high school newspaper. So, and so what we found is that we went from 17% to 23%. And, this is a silly kind of comparison, but if you compare the increase in take-up that you see just through this mild form of simplification, it is equivalent to almost what you would have seen had you doubled benefits, at least for this very intractable population. Now, this population is not very sensitive to economic incentives, so it's almost it's not a very strong statement. So we tested a number of other different variations of where we varied the complexity of the notices and the worksheets, where we heighten the salience and try to grab attention. And so on the next page, we mentioned the upper bound of what the benefit could be. And we found remarkably that from 23% we went to 36% just by mentioning that the benefit could be up to $3,000. If you mention that the benefits could be up to $5,000, you go down to 29%. So I think there are a number of lab studies that we did after the fact to try to understand how these notices affected beliefs and how people kind of process this take-up decision. And I think what's happening is that the higher the number, the more you think you are probably not eligible. It almost becomes like a clearinghouse sweepstakes. I mean, that's at least half of it. I think this is the first time that a trapezoidal tax schedule that you see in all these economic textbooks has ever been on an IRS form, and ours is not all that polished of a version, but I think it's probably the last time that the IRS will ever use this kind of graphic, because it actually lowered substantially. We tested, stigma manipulation, where we kind of emphasized that, this benefit is not welfare, it's due to your hard work, and there's really no effect. And then finally, we manipulated the worksheet where instead of the 6 requirements that you had to satisfy to return the form. And by the way, 98% of everyone who receives these forms are eligible, which begs the question of why isn't it automatized? And it should be. Although then they're going to get a paper and I wouldn't have a job, so trade-off here. But we reduced the 6 requirements to 2 requirements, and that increased take up by like 4 percentage points of that 17% baseline. On the earned income tax credit, what was interesting is that even amongst this fairly poor low-income population, those that were of lowest income within that group benefited the most from simplification. So program complexity, I think, is hugely important across a lot of different domains, and it fortunately, I think, affects those in most economic needs. So it has these regressive costs. So a second lesson, I'll go through this much more quickly, is that beyond simplifying kind of disclosures and the marketing of client information, I think there's great benefit of simplifying choice architecture and choice structures. And there's been a lot of work and Nobel Prizes being doled out for this idea that choice architecture matters. Dick Taylor won the Nobel Prize this past year, and one of the reasons I think was this work in leading kind of this movement towards nudges. So I spent a lot of time the last few years working on health insurance choice, and I think one of the important policy developments in the last few years has been this move towards expanding the amount of health plan choices that are available not only to individuals from the public provision of insurance, but also to employees from employer-sponsored plans. And most famously, the ACA on average provided individuals like 46 choice of amongst 46 different plans on average. Medicare exchanges 30 plans, and so the economic perspective is that more choice leads to more competition and better outcomes for consumers. The behavioral kind of perspective is that those benefits really only accrue if people make informed decisions and sensibly discriminate between choices, and if they can't, then we could have these adverse kind of effects due to a variety of different factors. So I won't talk about the main study that we kind of did in this area. This is a study with colleagues George Lowenstein and Justin Sidnor, but we found evidence from a large Fortune 100 firm that offered their employees quite a bit of choice, a choice of 48 different plans, of which, for a variety of reasons, many of which were financially dominated by other plans. So there's no basis for choosing certain plans versus other plans. And so it was a really nice litmus test for how fully employed Fortune 100 employees, how sensibly they made their health plan decisions. And we found that over half chose plans that in any circumstance, whether you don't go to the doctor at all or you get afflicted or you get run over by a car or something, by an Uber autonomous vehicle. But you would have been better off choosing another plan. Over 50% of employees chose these plans that necessarily led to excess spending. On average, it led to spending increases, or excess spending that was equivalent to about 24% of their premiums. And so in this other study that we did, which didn't involve administrative data, but we looked at the likely plan choices of individuals on the ACA exchanges. We first analyzed all of the plan data from several thousand different plans in the exchanges, and we estimated that if an individual were to choose a plan from the wrong tier, so as you guys know, the ACA is arranged, organized into these 4 different actuarial tiers, which are associated with these metallic labels, so bronze, silver, gold, platinum. Choosing the wrong tier could, regardless of how much care you need, choosing the wrong plan tier could lead to excess spending that, again, is of first order. So excess spending we eventually, skipping ahead, we ran some experiments to see actually how efficiently people did choose plans from hypothetical plan menus that were modeled after these changes. And we found something similar to this study that I just described, such that these adult subjects chose plans that were on average leading to excess spending of about 25% of their premiums. So I think the quality of choices that people make have these kind of first order implications, and they're much larger in magnitude than a lot of the issues that are monopolizing like the public discourse, like the availability of a public option or the rise in ACA premiums year to year. But so in this particular study that I'm not clearly describing, we tested 4 different types of labels to help people navigate these changes. So we tested the meta labels that are currently in the exchange, generic labels, Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, labels that emphasized medical usage. So are you a high medical user, medical user, low medical user? And then we added recommendations to the generic or to the meta labels. And what we found is that the meta labels performed the worst, and that there were all of the labels, none of the labels led to a vast amount of efficient choice, and I'm measuring efficiency here by ex ante information about utilization, but also looking to see how your choice changes as the menu becomes more and more clear. But what we found is that the medical use labels were the best of the ones we tested along with recommendations. And I think it just goes to make this point that what I think is happening is that people look at these meta labels and they think that, well, I can either stay at a Ritz or a Sheraton or a Best Western, and I want the concierge service. I want the better care, or I want the better care for my parents, etc. And in reality, these are just actuarial tiers. So they just signify how much cost sharing is associated with each group of plans, and therefore your decision should be an economic one. It should be based on your anticipated use of medical care and the cost difference. And so it's important for the choice architecture to actually reflect our understanding of how these decisions are made. I will say that going further, and this is something that we're trying to work with insurance companies on, is that I think beyond simplifying choice architecture, there's benefits to thinking about just fundamentally changing how insurance works. Why do we have deductibles and co-insurance? Well, the reasons to have cost sharing, but we're finding that most individuals just fundamentally don't know how a deductible translates into overall health costs. And so Oscar Health is one example of a new kind of firm that is playing around with this idea of fundamentally simplifying the incentives, underlying incentives of health insurance. And so we think that this is a direction that could be pursued in order to improve choices and then also improve utilization. I have similar gripes with like HSAs and the move towards HGHPs that have these high deductible plans. As great as they are in theory, I think they just magnify the complexity of health insurance. So I think you're probably over time, but I'll quickly go over this last bit, this last lesson, which is this is our this really nice recent report of Ideas 42. But this idea of facilitating action. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit of evidence from ongoing work that I've been doing for the last few years on retirement savings. This is joint with William Cannell Price, a student of mine, as well as Rick Mason and Shlomo Bernardsey from Boya. And so the puzzle in the space of retirement savings is that over the last several years, despite increasing access of employees to these really attractive 401k plans, which are tax advantaged, and they have often very generous matching incentives, even employees are just simply not seeing that, and they're not. We find that levels of preparedness for retirement are incredibly low, and we're some way low. And so our own kind of analysis of administrative data this project was in collaboration with Voya Financial, and they're the record keeper for like 5 million different employee 401k plans. Our own kind of analysis suggests that a significant share of actual full-time employees are who are enrolled in 401k plans are at risk for what we call retirement poverty or retirement insecurity. And so it's not just about people not taking up these plans, but it's about people enrolled in these plans simply not saving enough. And so we conclude for a lot of reasons that your initial decision in these plans, particularly in the context of automatic enrollment, is hugely important because your employees are unlikely to change their contribution rates over time. And these plans generally have really generous matching incentives. So I'll show you 2 pictures on this. So we ran a number of field experiments across 500 different firms that use Voya to administer their 401k plans. And so you can see a picture of the initial enrollment gateway, online gateway that all of these employees at all of these plans face. So this is in the context of automatic enrollment. The firm pushes you to go to this website to either confirm your automatic enrollment, to personalize your enrollment at a higher or a different savings rate, or to decline enrollment altogether. And you can see that those who personalize tend to save at a much higher rate than those who confirm automatic enrollment. And that's because our automatic enrollment rates are set really, really low for a variety of reasons. And what's remarkable, or we thought was remarkable, was that what we tested was a number of kind of non-economic changes to the design of this digital interface. So we changed the colors and some of the small descriptive language. We also reminded people what their automatic enrollment rate was very proximally to where they're clicking on an actual choice. And we found that these small changes, there's just one example here, substantially moved a significant portion of employees from automatic to essentially personalization. And subsequently, they chose rates that were much higher. And so we calculate that these design changes had the effect of essentially raising the generosity of the match by 70%. And changing colors is a lot cheaper than almost doubling the match, as far as I understand. And we think that these changes last because of inertia, and we have a number of calibrations that suggest that these small changes could lead to an average increase of years of retirement security of anywhere from 1 to 4, depending on a number of different factors. The last picture I'll show you is on these slides. The red line here, these slides show kind of the sensitivity of savings and contribution behavior to the generosity of the match. And so economists, this is another puzzle. So economists, you don't see that much elasticity with respect to more generous matches. So the more generous the match, you should see a lot higher savings because it's free money on the table. And so the blue line represents kind of the status quo. So it's relatively flat. But once you enhance the design in the particular way that we happen to test with these pretty colors, you see a change not only in the level of take-up, but in the slope. So I think this emphasizes nicely how psychological design can not only change kind of average take-up and average compliance, but can actually amplify the underlying economic incentives, which is great because the economic incentives are important in shaping behavior. The last point I'll make about this study is that we then surveyed hundreds of actual plan administrators, HR officials, plan sponsors, and we asked them to predict, well, how would your employees respond to a change in match generosity? How would they then respond to a change in colors or language? And their intuitions were way off. I think they were different than economists might predict, but then that's not saying much. And so I think this speaks to the point that design can really matter, particularly as we move to these digital interfaces, but they're not at all regulated. And the regulation that embodies or governs kind of disclosures, like an underlying economic benefit structures is so dense, but then there's kind of no digital fiduciary responsibility that firms or third parties have on the basic design and the ease and potentially predatory pressure of these digital kind of interfaces. And so we think that's something, So one of the people at the firm took this paper, and I think were at the DOL last week, kind of telling them some of these results. But I think it really speaks to this need to expand our understanding of policy and consumer protection to include like these aspects of design. So I'm sure I'm way over.
No. That's fine. Scott, you there? Is he there?
I'm here.
He's going to be putting up his PowerPoints from the distance side, so if we can get out of this. There he is. Scott, if you'd like to go next, that would be great.
It was great. I really appreciated the first two presentations. It was smart stuff, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about the pieces. I'll talk briefly. I know we want to kind of stay on track. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I eavesdropped on some of the morning conversations. It sounds like we're having a really nice gathering and a lot of good exchange. We're going to be able to come in from remote. I'm just going to say a couple things related to my work, the changing geography of poverty that I think are relevant for some of the conversation we've been having around supports for workers in low-wage jobs. Excuse me. And then also, I'll talk a little bit about the employer surveys from our minimum wage study. I know Mark Long spoke this morning about some of our labor market findings, and I'll say just a few things about our employer surveys, and then I'll conclude with maybe a few observations or thoughts about paths forward as we seek strategies and initiatives to support workers in low-wage jobs. This comes from my book, Places in Need, which came out last summer, and it talks about the changing geography of poverty in the U.S. Oftentimes when we're having conversations about low-income households, we think about that in almost an exclusively urban context. And it makes sense because poverty is not only more highly concentrated in cities, but also racially segregated in cities, and those acute problems draw our attention, as they should. It's important to keep in mind that actually poverty problems have gotten much worse in suburbs, and there are more people numerically who are poor in suburbs than in cities. And again, the rates and the concentration of poverty remain far more acute in cities, but poverty is a suburban problem. And I know this is a reality in the Allegheny region. It's a reality in every metro area, country large or small. But this challenges some of our presuppositions about how the safety net is constructed and where we target our resources and efforts. And I think the changing geography of poverty has some implications for how we provide help and supports to low-wage workers. And so in the book, I talk about kind of the difference between federally funded and regulated and administered programs and those that have a lot of state and local variation. In the book, I talk about the Earned Income Tax Credit and SNAP as two federally funded, highly regulated programs. They've both been featured already in just this session today, and I'm sure have been parts of conversations in other sessions. And the reality is that even as the geography of poverty shifts and increases in places where poverty problems may not have been as significant in the past, our safety net is unevenly responsive. What are responsive are federally funded programs that don't require a lot of state or local contribution, and that also don't provide a lot of state or local discretion. And the Earned Income Tax Credit is a perfect example of that. And here I just show you the median EITC refund per filer in 2010 across urban counties in purple, suburban counties in black, and rural counties in blue. Relative modest difference per filer. If you looked at filing totals and their responsiveness to poverty, you'd see very similar trends and trajectories across different types of geography. So the EITC is really responsive. Now there's ways we can make it more responsive, as was suggested by Saurabh previously, but this program works, and it reaches everybody kind of the same way, no matter where they live, when you control for eligibility. SNAP is the same way in many ways. Even though SNAP does have a bit more local discretion and certainly some state discretion, SNAP is also quite responsive to changes in poverty. And here, I just throw up the change in the number of low-income persons within about 150% of poverty from 2000 to 2010 compared to the SNAP caseload change. And you see it's not really a one-to-one relationship, but it's really close. And so SNAP caseloads go up when need goes up. And this program is very responsive historically to fluctuations in need and to increases in the number of low-income households or workers. By contrast, social service programs, which we spend probably about $200 billion a year on, and provide a lot of the supports that we know matter for low-wage workers and for their families, whether it's job search and job assistance, residential housing assistance, emergency food or shelter, help with mental health or substance abuse services. The social service safety net is really critical to how we support people. And I know in a school social work, that's not news, right? It's actually news maybe in other fields, but this is the work that we do in social work. But this is a highly localized and decentralized support safety net, one that it really is relying on local organizations, often nonprofit organizations, and local political will and local resources. And what you see here is a chart of the kind of median nonprofit human service expenditures per low-income person across urban counties, suburban counties, and rural counties. Now, this isn't perfect. It's a good heuristic. I think I don't know if I hang my hat on the exact point estimates because these data are a little noisy, but I think it tells you something that I think we all recognize is that, a lot of our human service capacity is targeted at cities. And even though access isn't great in cities, in lots of ways we could do better, the disparities between urban places and suburban or rural places are really striking. And so even though poverty has increased dramatically in suburban locations and poverty problems have been persistent for 80, 90 years in many rural counties, if not longer, the resources we target at those places lag well behind what we are able to do in cities. And, if we think that part of the solution to the dilemmas that low-wage workers face is helping them grab the next rung on the ladder, helping them weather a period of unemployment or underemployment. Access to these kinds of organizations is critical, and the reality is it's just in too many places there are no organizations with too little capacity. And even more important, this part of the safety net is not really responsive to changes in poverty. So again, this is a scatter plot just of urban and suburban counties of changes in poverty on the x-axis, and then changes in nonprofit human service expenditures on the y-axis. And what you see is kind of a random scatter of points. Some counties do much better when poverty increases. Some counties cut back expenditures altogether. We don't really know why this happens. Actually, this would be a good dissertation for some entrepreneurial students in the audience there. But what this suggests is that our nonprofit human service safety net is not necessarily responsive to changes in poverty, or not immediately responsive to them. And there's lots of reasons for that, which I could talk about in Q&A. But it underscores the fact that this localized element of our safety net, which we're highly dependent on, doesn't necessarily work the same in all places. Now, to pivot a little bit and to kind of kick back to some of what Jeff and I talked about at the outset when we were thinking about my comments today, I just want to say a couple more things about the Seattle minimum wage study. First, I don't know if Mark was able to do this morning, but the study itself has lots of components. And none of us were minimum wage researchers when we started it, but we were all interested in inequality and poverty. And we knew that there were a lot of questions that people weren't answering in the conventional minimum wage literature. And so we have a bunch of data from different sources. Mark talked about the UI data. We're excited about linking our UI data to program participation and information and other sources of administrative data, so we can actually talk about the poverty effects that we see in Seattle and in the state here. But we also did employer surveys with both for-profit and nonprofit organizations, which I think give us an insight into how employers respond. And it really matters because employers are, what employers do is actually what shapes the impact and outcomes of these laws. And there's lots of different channels of adjustment employers can pursue, but ultimately the effects we see on the ground are the result of what employers decide to do, how they decide to change business practice or business strategy to accommodate higher costs. Most of the discussion is about food and accommodations in this literature. What we've done in our study is expand that a little bit and look at a much broader array of employers. And I think the labor market data we have suggests that if you only focus on food, you're really missing not only a large part of the low-wage labor market, but you're missing a big part of the story, at least from our perspective. We also focus on nonprofits, and nonprofits matter not just because of the services they provide to vulnerable populations, but also they employ a lot of low-wage workers. Many people in the nonprofit sector are earning below maybe what they would in a comparable private sector job, but there are a variety of reasons why that work appeals to them. And we might think that the way that nonprofits respond may be different than private sector employers. And the example I always give is, it's really hard for a substance abuse provider that relies on Medicaid reimbursement to shift its pricing on services. You're in contracts, you have fixed rates, and you can't just increase the price of a service a little bit like you could if you were a Subway sandwich franchise. You just tweak the sub a nickel or something like that and compensate for the increase. It's just not possible for many nonprofits. And in our work, we drew, it's a panel survey of employers. This just gives you a sense of what we did. We started with a draw of Seattle business licenses. We screened them for low-wage workers, and then of those we invited probably several thousand here, I guess almost 4,000 to participate in our survey. And in the end, a lot of organizations, even though we thought they may have low-wage workers based on the screener, turned out not to have any workers under $15 an hour, and so they weren't eligible for the study, which is kind of striking in and of itself as well, kind of giving Seattle's evidence kind of some asterisks perhaps, because our experience here is probably very different than what you'd find in other places where the wage levels weren't nearly as high. But we asked a lot of questions about firm characteristics, compensation, prices. We got pretty good representation across a number of different sectors. We did a nonprofit oversample, which isn't in this chart, but we wanted to make sure that we got nonprofits because there isn't really a good sampling frame for nonprofits. So we dropped in another 400 nonprofits from community directories into this and interviewed them as well. Real quickly, most nonprofits were complying, and for-profit firms were complying by increasing wages, and so the law actually has its effect, and I'm sure Mark talked about this morning. Lots of organizations and firms were raising wages, and not just for workers below 15, but for workers above 15. We see evidence of spillover up the wage ladder. The responses of firms varied. Actually, we saw fairly significant responses among for-profit firms, mostly around prices, but about a quarter reduced hours or headcount to some degree. And these are all based on self-reports, but they are really consistent with what we see in our administrative data, and we find they're consistent with the in-depth interviews that we've done with firms and nonprofits. Nonprofit organizations, one of the realities which we were really surprised about is most nonprofits in Seattle didn't have workers earning less than $15 an hour, and this is even in the most kind of vulnerable sectors. And so, at some level, the impact of these laws will remain to be seen down the road as we continue to move forward and past $15 an hour. But largely, we didn't see a lot of changes in service provision and staffing. We did see efforts on behalf of nonprofits to seek greater revenues or different revenues or make cases to funders for enhanced revenues because of higher wage costs. But really the message we got both from the surveys and from our in-depth interviews with nonprofits was it's a pretty uncertain time to be a nonprofit organization. In fact, actually, as one respondent said after the election of 2016, if only the higher minimum wage was what we were really worried about. They're worried about changes in federal funding. They're worried about federal safety net programs under attack. They're worried about the impact of those cuts on their clients and on their program funding. And in many ways, the minimum wage is just one, but maybe not the most important factor, not only shaping nonprofit behavior, but for-profit firm behavior too in this environment. But the reality is that we should expect, because this is a fairly significant change, a lot of organizations can't make quick changes. It makes sense that they're going to have longer-term planning around this and thinking about how to adjust provision of services, headcount, staffing over the long haul so they can not only have a sustainable organization, but also do right by their clients. Now, kind of what does this all mean for us as we think about supporting low-wage workers, kind of the suburban poverty piece and its implications for the safety net as well as the minimum wage piece? First, and I think this has been kind of implicit in the conversations I've heard today, we really need to challenge the popular stereotypes about poverty and its causes and who is poor and where they live. Too often we associate poverty with people of color in cities, and I think that plays to our most pernicious stereotypes about the poor, but also to racial prejudice, and I think that not only undermines support for safety net programs, but it really it damages our ability to have frank and thoughtful conversations about need in our country. I think it's really important for us to understand who wins and loses, if you will, in local policy experiments, and that's across a variety of things that we're doing locally, because there's not much happening at the federal level right now. But particularly with minimum wage laws, I think it's important to realize that there are going to be households that really benefit from higher wage rates, but there's also families and workers that won't, and they don't show up in our data as clearly, I think. And I think Mark talked a little bit about that today when he talked about our longitudinal study. But I don't think we can be ideological about this to the extent that I think we trend towards sometimes. I think we need to push for stable federal funding for safety net programs and seeking new program dollars, not just a reallocation of dollars from cities to other places. We need to think about other ways to strengthen our local safety nets, and some of that relates to cultural competence and serving immigrant communities in a professional and culturally competent manner. Some of that means working with communities of faith more intentionally, which I know is something that in many sectors of academia we're not comfortable with, but I think if we're not talking to communities of faith, it's really hard to push ahead in communities where poverty problems are persistent. We need to think about better data and improved research translation. Actually, one of the things I appreciated about Saurabh's presentation was just how easily accessible that is to a variety of stakeholders. It's really critical we train the next generation of indigenous local leaders, people who are going to take over the organizations and lead them into the next several decades, but folks who have to flip scripts between kind of the policy structures and political elites and the communities of color that they represent. We need to train them and give them full and robust toolkits, but also help them access those positions, and maybe for older white men in particular, stepping back and allowing the next generation of folks to lead. And then I think ultimately we also have to talk about our shared fate about poverty problems across geography. As I argue, if we don't see poverty as a problem for all our families, all our neighborhoods, all our friends and colleagues, it's not a problem that we'll ever tackle in any one community effectively. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the audience here. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Audrey, last but by no means least for today.
I was looking at it, I was like, okay, this is an interesting collection of topics to put together. Being in the School of Business, and particularly in my role as director of the Center for Ethics and Leadership, we do a lot with business and this issue of corporate social responsibilities. It's really from that vantage point that I want to talk about it. And to me, it's really a broader discussion about how we reframe this issue of support for low-wage workers, the issue of working poor, or a whole host of things that you've been talking about during these sessions, to being a matter of business responsibility to be able to balance economic as well as social and individual impact is sort of fundamental in terms of how we talk about issues related to corporate social responsibility. And so, this notion about living wage or fair wage and the like has been something that's been bandied around, not just as social policy, but as organizational policy. What is the organization's responsibility to be able to offer fair wage and a living wage for employees, and what happens when that doesn't happen? And this notion of fair wage is really complicated because a lot of times, and this is true in the literature, you see that this notion of fairness of wages and the perception of fairness wages is really much more complicated than just looking at what is legal minimum standard. And so I often have this conversation with people about looking at issues related to what we define as in the realm of ethical and corporate social responsibility not being a matter of legal standards, because when it comes to the whole range of things about the well-being of workers, we could broaden this to talking about issues of workplace safety and the like, which all fall under the overall umbrella of what is the organization's responsibility to provide safe, fair, access, affordable, culturally sensitive, equitable environments, and how do we understand that, and how do we hold organizations accountable? It's a lot of the work that we do. And so even if a company pays the national minimum, meets other legal responses. I mean, we see this particularly if you look at this issue in a global context, that organizations can do things that are by the book, absolutely legal, but are extraordinarily harmful and detrimental to the health and well-being of its employees. And so this notion of looking at corporate social responsibility as a framework for understanding what are in the best interest of the well-being of workers, and particularly the issues in terms of low-wage workers, is something that I think is a necessary framing, because it moves it beyond just this legal standard and sometimes this non-winning battle about what is a fair legal wage, because more often than not, we're not factoring in the whole thing about what it takes to have sustainable families when we start talking about the battle over just looking at the issue of wage. So, you know, how do you also look at issues of something that I'm very akin to, is issues of disparity. So, yes, we can create poverty situations. There's really extensive work on this about looking at the persistence of gender discrimination and in pay, and what that does to lead to issues we sort of talk about what happens at retirement. So if you have a gap, and we see this from when our students graduate from college, there's a persistent gap based on gender in terms of starting salary that persists and actually widens over time, which then leads to a gap in terms of contribution, a gap in terms of what you're able to be able to afford upon retirement. And so that retirement issue about retiring poor is actually exacerbated for certain demographic groups. Isn't that part of what we should be talking about in terms of corporate social responsibility when we talk about issues of wages and low wages and across all of the different wage scales? How we look at issues in terms of not only living wage and minimum wage and prevailing wage, but other things that companies will sometimes be able to do to be able to look at classification of workers, you know, as either exempt or non-exempt, has huge implications. And so I remember in one organization that they actually reclassify when this was right around when we were pushing issues in terms of what was the minimum level of pay before you move from one classification to the next. And there was this huge push and a huge rush to be able to reclassify, certain workers to be able to get up under that standard. And what you had is, okay, we're going to promote you to be manager of aisle 7, because what that does is to change your classification. And then all of a sudden, this whole notion of wages is also about how much time you're being asked to work in that particular wage structure. So what can look like it's a living wage really isn't when you start looking at how workers are classified and then how much time they're being asked to devote to be able to earn that particular wage. That's right now the controversy over Amazon, right? You've been reading a lot of the controversy over the non-executive level of workers within Amazon. That's really what the fight is. It's like, okay, they're classified in a certain level where they're able to, in a sense, get way more work per hour than the salary would suggest. And isn't that an issue? So what could look like it's not a low wage issue really is. It absolutely is. And that to me is one of the advantages of looking at this in this broader context of corporate social responsibility. So you're not just looking at explicitly what is the payment of wages or living wage or minimum wage, but what is it? What's the pay system that's involved? And how, and it's looking at not just the pay system, but how compensation is structured such that you're getting a fair compensation given the effort. Okay? Because it's amazing to me, you'd be surprised the number of staff at institutions, and higher ed is just as guilty of this. Higher ed is just as guilty as this. You'd be surprised the number of staff who work extra jobs or who work full-time here and on some sort of public assistance. You'd be surprised, particularly in the schools in this region. And so this notion of looking at a wage leads to balanced wage structure and compensation, which is not just the absolute wage or salary, but total compensation. Okay? And then looking at equity across different types of compensation structures and packages. To me, this notion of talking about issues in terms of employer practices that can better support low-wage workers can't happen without an explicit acknowledgement of persistent wage discrimination and wage disparity. And if there's one thing that really makes this notion of the perpetual negative and detrimental effects of not looking at this in the broader context of social responsibility, it's that it gets us to be able to ignore and not take responsibility and not holding organizations accountable for persistent wage disparity and wage discrimination. And unfortunately, they're getting better at hiding it than we're being at detecting it. Much more sophisticated. And then the other thing that I think this whole notion about talking about support for low-wage workers is also in terms of looking at the other aspects of work and things like work intensity and the issues of what are involved in the broader issues of safety and reasonable work, you know. And it's almost like we need to start talking about healthy workplaces. And that's one of the things that looking at this in a broader lens of corporate social responsibility does to me is it changes our vocabulary, it changes what we look at as the criterion for what an effective environment for not just low-wage workers, but all workers must look like. And so this notion of looking at the intensity of work and the hours of work, and when you start broadening that, it actually goes across not just unskilled, semi-skilled, and the like. It goes all the way up to professional. I mean, we've seen over time the huge amount of debate that goes on within the nursing profession over hours worked, over working conditions, and things that not only have a detrimental effect on the quality of care, but have a much bigger effect on the quality of health and well-being of the employees. The same thing has gone on with pilots in terms of hours worked, intensity, stress, and the like. And so this notion of support for employer practices in terms of support for low-wage workers needs to really broaden into this dialogue or this framework of how we talk about the broader issues of corporate social responsibility. Or if not, it just becomes a wage battle, and then a huge amount of things that affect all workers, but disproportionately affect workers at the lower end and disproportionately affect certain demographic groups don't get raised as equally part of the responsibility of us to raise and track those issues, and equally part of a dialogue that we need to have about holding employers accountable for the total experience, the total healthy experience of employees that are up under their responsibility. And again, this notion of really paying attention to always talking about wage discrimination, wage disparity as part of this dialogue has to be. To me, I can't talk about issues of low-wage workers without understanding the role that wage disparity and discrimination plays in this. And that, to me, it's odd to me that I'm constantly having to provide a justification as to why issues related to discrimination and disparity come up under the category of corporate social responsibility. They do. They live there. They built a home there, right there on the intersection of disparity and discrimination lane. That's where the issues of corporate social responsibility, has to be able to live. And I think it gets into issues in terms of rights and responsibilities of organizations to their employees as well. And so oftentimes I find particularly in the wage debate, it becomes very politicized, in a way that I think doesn't allow us to move toward effective decisions if it's just a political policy decision as opposed to an ethics and a social responsibility discussion, then that gives us different types of leveraging for organizations when it's seen as unethical, in much the same way we've dealt with in the U.S. safety issues, when we've dealt in the U.S. about how we look at child labor. There's certain things that fall into that category of things that you just don't do in terms of how we deal with the situation of workers. But we don't talk about pay disparity. We don't talk about any sort of wage disparity, and we don't talk about low-wage workers in the same way as we talk about issues of child labor, right? Or workplace safety in terms of really traumatic things that can lead to death of employees. And it's odd to me that we don't, because it's all about the total health and safety and what is right and just in terms of equitable treatment of all types of employees. And so that's part of what I want to enter into the dialogue, is a way of being able to take the data that we all know and that we've talked about and we've talked about this session, and reframe this in the context of a broader dialogue about what are the responsibilities of employers, and how do we hold employers accountable for doing things that we do or not doing things that we know that are going to be detrimental to workers, and particularly low-wage workers. So I think we have about 2 minutes left. I'll stop there so we can have at least 10 minutes left.
Sure, Lisa has some opinions about what we need to do to hold employers, to encourage employers to be responsible. But that does become a question. You talked about federal laws, right? Child labor laws, et cetera, that have been put in place. What more can we do? Is it tax incentives? What do we do to get employers?
I think the laws work, and I think part of what we have to do is to protect those laws and not allow them to be weakened. But laws only work when we allow the resources for enforcement. And if you see, and the best place to be able to see this historically, both from an employer standpoint and from a policy standpoint, is in the area of workplace safety. I mean, if you look at, in a U.S. context, I would be specific there, because it matters when you go outside of the U.S. context. We're talking about safety. When you look historically about what it took to put measures and enforcement and standards in place that stopped, it was a process. We sometimes put policies in place, but don't put the standards and the process and the enforcement in place to be able to make sure that we stick. We've been more successful. Not perfect, by no means, not perfect. We've been more successful there. So I'm a big fan of looking at how we've done this in the past in certain areas, and then extrapolating from that into other areas about issues in terms of fairness of treatment and providing wages that are able to be seen as just and socially responsible in the exact same way we were able to have that dialogue, that very challenging and difficult dialogue about workplace safety. So that's just one example.
I'm going to open it up to questions. We have about 8 minutes left. Questions, comments to any of the panel members. Although yes, Scott is still here. Hi, Scott. I thought we lost you for a second. To any of the panel members about this topic, sort of the policies and the supports we have in place and the supports we could have in place.
Yeah, I just want to say I think it's really important that you raise sort of these other thoughts, like intensity of work and seeing like worker energy as a limited resource, because as I was reviewing the literature on what do we know about how do these effects, how does low wage work sort of trickle out into the family, I'm really interested in the work family spillover effects. And a lot of it is about schedule. So, are women working or not? What schedules are they working? And that's been researched really heavily. But things like how much emotional energy do you put out at your work? How tired are you when you get home? How many people have you had to care for and then come home to also care for? Those kinds of things haven't really been looked at as far as how does that affect people's ability to contribute to their community or their family. And so I really thought that was I just want to echo that that's really important to continue to think about how to research that, because I think it's much more than just wage. It's how does the work environment affect you.
Well, it's true, and again, the safety is both physical as well as psychological safety. So if you look at now what's going on with hotel chains putting alert devices, on the hotel staff. Now we all know who we're talking about. We're talking about most hotel staff that are servicing rooms. We all know, what level they are in the organization, and much more likely who they're likely to look like. So without them explicitly saying what's the threat in terms of danger, but they now have to put panic buttons that the hotel chains are needing to make that standard practice, lets you know that that's a threat predominantly for women, predominantly for immigrant women and women of color that are at the lowest wage scale, that are at risk, and they're and so now think about, we've extended this social responsibility to protecting workers from the customer. I mean, and it's both physical as well as psychological safety that they're trying to address.
I think that point really resonates with me, and particularly as we think about kind of the gig economy and how folks that work in those kinds of jobs, not unlike hotel workers, are exposed to risks and hazards, and also to customers in ways that are really different than the traditional jobs that they may mirror. Audrey, I totally agree with what you said. I think it's so important for us to be considering these risks and hazards and account for it, not just in our rhetoric, but in our work and in how we think about work that works things for low wage households.
I was thinking, there's such a, I don't know what I would call it, like a sort of bias in our society towards we go very quickly in our mind from work to job, right? Which I think probably happens, in places like our society more. But I remember reading a book. My training's as a historian, and I just can't think of the woman who wrote it, but you might have read it. It's called Joy My Freedom. It was a history of the activities of freed women not long after the Civil War, young freed women who were in kind of urban areas, right? And one of the things that was really exciting to them was being able to stay out and dance. They really like to do it. They really like to stay out all night and dance. And then their job, and they consider that to be their work, right? Because work is just, I got to move my mind or my heart or my muscles or my whatever. It's work. Dancing is pretty hard work. But it's work that people chose for themselves, and it was unpaid work, infinitely preferable to them than their paid work, which was for some, white woman somewhere in the city cleaning the house. And they would show up really tired from having danced all night, and the labor relations conflict was kind of over sleep, because the housekeepers would want to come in and kind of tuck into a bedroom somewhere and sort of sleep because they'd been dancing all night, and the white women were all about, like, you can't go get good help anymore. And, for me, that kind of like illuminated something about how we think about the kind of work in the ecology of a human life. Because what a job is mostly when you go to work for somebody else, often doing something that you love, but often doing something that you would just as soon not do. And I mean, does anybody want to work in a coal mine? I mean, no one wants to work in a coal mine. What people want is something else that you can only get in a coal mine, called money, to buy a cabin on a creek, right? And so, I think the task that we have is to try to define an ecology of work and income and satisfaction that people can access. It will probably differ for people. Stay-at-home mom has one kind of thing. You got to get one kind of thing to get there. Auto workers hated their jobs, hated them, because who wants to stand all day going goop, 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 and you can't eat when you want to? But when you went home, your time was your own, and you could go home, and you had a union job, and you probably didn't die. And I just think, I don't know, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to echo what you were saying, is that the kind of, I just can't think of it as anything other than an ecology. We have so much time on this earth. We have our bodies, we have our minds. Can we figure out systems that let us employ that and deploy that in a way that keeps us out of want, keeps us from having so much stress that we can't teach our children appropriately when we get home? Can we kind of get there? And we're talking about like guaranteed jobs. Like, really, like, why not talk about guaranteed income? Like, what does every conversation about our lives have to start with who are we selling ourselves to? Does every conversation have to start that way? I don't know, maybe it does.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about one of the questions that we ask our parents is, what are the challenges of parenting, of course, and what are the joys, but then also what are you trying to teach your children? And I'm like itching to analyze it, but I've done a lot of the interviews, and what I hear are things like, I want them to know that no one's going to help you and you have to work for yourself. I want them to know that they need to be independent. I want them to know what it takes to do work, and I want them to see me working hard. And it's work. It's not joy. It's not, I don't know what else it could be, but it's related to work. And I think when I analyze it, that is what we will find, is that these narratives are the narratives to survive. And that's, I think that when we think sort of, a lot of this conversation is about just survival. It's not about anything much more glamorous than that. And unfortunately, I think that that's sort of the rhetoric that goes around for low-wage work. It sort of like aligns with these other prejudices of this sector. And I think that one thing Sarah and I talk about a lot is bringing in happiness or satisfaction or leisure or some of these other things that we might talk about with more professional workers, work-life balance, that isn't really working for that group either, but isn't even really a conversation.
Well, but I think the other part of this, and this particularly happens when you leave a U.S.-centric perspective, is the definition of work, right? As something that you have to earn, so it's not a right. It's seen as a privilege, which is much more of a U.S. perspective, as opposed to this is a fundamental human right, which you get when you go outside of a U.S. context, that people have to be as human beings. We have to be actively engaged in work, and it is really the right of people to be able to to provide for themselves, and it's the expectation that that's what both business and government and society should do, is provide an opportunity to fulfill that fundamental need that we have as human beings to provide for ourselves, which is not the way we talk about work in a U.S. context. It is really not. It comes from a much more of a privilege and a meritocracy, and a sort of it's not a fundamental right sort of structure, and that's also what trips us up, what trips business up in a global context, is when we do certain things, because we don't really understand that we have fundamentally different assumptions, and we can even talk about it at the individual level versus the collective level, and there's a bunch of different cultural dimensions that play a role there. So when you look at it in a broader context, it challenges us to talk about, it's not just wages, but what does work mean? And I'm really, I've really been thinking about this a lot with all the publicity around the one actor about the work shaming at
Trader Joe's.
Trader Joe's, and I've been
It wasn't
really
about Trader Joe's. It was about him being work shamed.
It's about him being work shamed, exactly. And his responses, one of his responses is let's switch the style. Let's talking about what does it mean to be, to be gainfully employed and to be able to provide for you and your family, as opposed to status and hierarchy and privilege and the like. And I'm thinking, okay, you're having the wrong you're in the wrong culture to have that conversation. That is not how we talk about work.
Although, to bring it home, the Upser in their recent newsletter talked about the fact that in the Pittsburgh region, 48% of employees have a bachelor's degree or more, but in the last decade, the largest percentage of employment, the largest gains in employment have been generated by workers with less than a high school education. So,
what? Oh, okay. Well, is it okay? I wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
We're shifting gears.
Yeah, but can you
bit.
make your comment first too?
Oh,
yeah. Go
well,
ahead.
I was going to say one promising, perhaps trajectory, and I think, by the way, the Trader Joe guy, he had to leave his job, but then Tyler Perry offered him a role on his next
Sorry to have gotten this off the
It was a happy ending there, but so
and he's got a Nike contract. He'll be fine.
it'll be good. Hopefully, he still keeps his Trader Joe's discount for a while. But so, in talking to a lot of HR executives at particularly large companies, because a lot of my research involves trying to convince them to run studies on their benefit programs. But this trend that I think is increasingly becoming popular, particularly in the U.S., is firms investing in financial and health wellness programs. And even in terms of looking at the aggregate delivery investment in these programs is really growing. And I think it's based not on this underlying benevolence, but on this belief that there's an ROI associated with happy and financially less anxious employees. And I think part of this narrative, I don't know whether or not that kind of causal story is true, but part of this narrative is driven by, I think, a lot of the work that Gallup has done with their employee engagement surveys, where they have these in-the-moment measures of happiness and well-being and engagement. And they claim that 90% of workers are feeling unengaged, but that those who are engaged are much more productive. Obviously, that's just a correlation, but I think it's something that firms have really bought into, and at least the pattern that I'm seeing is that there's increasing attention being placed on financial and health wellness. We haven't seen, I think, wage displacement yet, and I don't know if this pattern of investment is going to continue, or if it's restricted to the largest of firms. But yeah, to me that's, I guess, so a promising kind of aspect of the landscape.
It's a, make no mistake, that's a tremendous risk management strategy that corporations are doing. And from an ethics and social responsibility standpoint, it's controversial because employees are very wary of participating in those because there's huge monitoring. There was a controversy about the workplace, workout things where, you can come in and keep track like you do in a gym of workout, and organizations not only tracking that, but providing incentives for people who are engaged in healthy behavior, which you got to read the flip side. If we're providing incentives for healthy behavior, then that actually means that you're creating an implicit disparity in the others. And so it's really, and that trend is increasing. You're absolutely right, and it's controversial.
Yeah, and at one firm that they're based out of Pittsburgh that I work with, they invest a lot in their wellness program and their health program, and particularly amongst their lower earners, there's very, very low rates of participation. And one of their fears from talking to employees and surveying employees is that they think that this firm is going to use their data, their health data, to affect their insurance prices, which is, there's a strict kind of wall between the two.
Right.
But there's this fear and distrust that is just there.
Sometimes paranoia is based on reality.
Yeah. I think also there is kind of like pick and choose. This is what I was trying to get at. Again, I remember the Memphis sanitation workers strike, right? Which was it was about money, and what people kept saying to them is like, oh, well, what you need is a coat, or what you need is food, or what you need is whatever. And what they would say is like, we need money.
Yes.
Because part of having a good life is I remember it clear as day, being able to pick and choose as other people do. And I think that dimension of having the rewards of work not always be dictated by your employer, but in fact being in those kind of fungible forms that we can use to build ecologies if we don't die because we're doing Uber and somebody attacks us in our car. That's part of, when you talk about $15, why $15 an hour is not the same as $12 an hour in food stamps. Why it's not the same as because that's part of an ecology of freedom, that I think we want to keep our eye on. It's not the same as saying, hey, you know what, get on this bicycle and you're going to feel better. That's not the same thing as $5 to take your kid to the movies, even if from the employer's point of view, those two things are the same thing. Jeff, you wanted to...
I don't want to be that student that keeps the class. But
I do see them on Snapchat.
Well, and
You're going
feel
to
free to quickly talk about. We have some just really fascinating things that were brought up back to the whole other programs and other things to support workers, right? So one of the take-home points that we have is, and I think Scott put it up there, on one side. The minimum wage is a tool, maybe not the best tool, not the only tool, right?
Right.
So that we have to, and that was echoed all day by other folks. We got to think about these other ways of doing things. So I have, not only are we dealing in a time where the funding for those other things is not great and not there, but also there are a lot of barriers to really accessing and really, in a positive way. So I don't know, Scott, if you could talk to someone more I'm really struck by your slides with the EITC and human services money in the suburban and urban rural divide. And I'm also, for the two of you, in terms of the EITC form is really fascinating. Is there other work going on looking at how we can improve around public benefits? And Sophie, you talked about how New York has adopted some to make them more worker-friendly. So I don't know if we could end with the three of you sort of sharing just some of your thoughts on how we can do better.
The question is, how do we make the safety net work better for workers and for families?
The obstacles that you're seeing across geography.
Yeah, I think I talked about it a little bit at the end, probably too quickly, but part of it I think is thinking about local capacity and thinking about how we can create support services that are going to be there regardless of where you live when you experience moments of hardship or need. And I think today, a big part of our safety net is highly contingent on where you live. And I think that we tolerate inequality in access to a variety of safety net programs that we wouldn't, like if I said, we'll pay this kind of person, or we say, a food stamp benefit for this kind of person is 50 cents on the dollar, this kind of person, we would never tolerate that kind of inequity within our safety net programs. By race, ethnicity, gender, whatever have you, but yet we observe those kinds of disparities in access to a variety of our safety net programs on the ground level. I think one of the things I really worry about, and I'll say this, I have to step off in a minute, I worry about the current climate around immigration and how it's forcing a lot of organizations to go on the down low in the work they do. And I saw this in my field work for my book where a real poignant moment where I went into an organization that was providing GED and job search, and the posters on the windows outside were basically of white folks going, at computer terminals. And when you went inside, it was all English as a second language, primarily Spanish-speaking clients. And I asked the ED, why is your outward face so different than your inward work? And she said, well, if we told people what we were doing, we get shut down because people don't like immigrants in our community. And then she told me an example of an organization that got defunded because people, protested at county council meetings. And I think that is a reality today that is pervasive across communities. And I worry about things like that. We're in a moment where this is real, and I think it has a lot of downstream consequences for families in need and for the organizations that serve them. And that'll be my last comment. I'll listen. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I think there's been a bit of a policy revolution of sorts over the last 20 years, in the sense that maybe starting institutionally with the rise of the nudge unit in the UK. Now we have 60 different countries, including the US, with nudge or behavioral science units that are charged with this goal of incorporating insights from psychology and behavioral science into the administration of policy. And it's I think it's taken a bit of a break the last few years, but Obama was just a huge advocate of this enterprise. And now some of the slack, I think, has been picked up at the local and municipal level, where the former head of the U.S. nudge unit essentially is starting one in the D.C. area, and it's kind of become a model for other city and state nudge units. And so there's been just a host of really nice innovations with respects to, certainly EITC has, adopted these new designs throughout all their communications, and they're exploring kind of, other tests to improve their communications and their marketing. A few students and I are working with the pretrial services here in Allegheny County, and we've given them a lot of advice on how to redesign how they engage pretrial detainees and defendants, where there's huge examples of situations where there are these small kind of administrative burdens, showing up for enrollment at a particular time, and if you don't show up, then your risk score just jumps up, or could be detained, etc. And so I think that's just a problem of redesigning engagement with the population in a way that's more kind of humanely informed. In education, unemployment, all these different policy sectors, I think there's been movement and a recognition that they have to be smarter, like firms are in terms of marketing and engagement. I will say that while there are always promising developments kind of around these areas, one thing that we haven't seen is kind of this move to more fundamentally change the structure of a lot of policies to make them simpler, fundamentally, simplify like the tax code, or simplify kind of how health insurance is set up. There's some startups that I've seen that are doing some really cool kind of innovative things like in the fintech and health tech sector that I think a lot of us academics are probably not aware of. But we'll see kind of if they take off. Oscar, for example, on the health side.
Yeah, so in New York State, the income limit for SNAP was raised to 150% of the poverty line. But I think one thing that sprung to mind, something that maybe hasn't been discussed too much today, is how housing costs really moderate the effects of any sort of wage increase. Right. And so I don't have any big ideas in that area, but I think it's something that really should be always considered, because no matter how much you're raising wages, it's impossible to live in some cities, and that probably will eventually spill out into suburbs as we talk about the sprawling nature of poverty, and then how that looks in rural setting might be different, but it's probably extremely problematic as well. So something to consider as an area.
Okay. Final comments on this topic?
Can I just say that I sort of, in a bit of a darker tone, the contrast between the two of you in terms of, on the one hand, discussing SNAP. So we often, with malicious intent, erect barriers to prohibit participation in programs. Right. And then there are, of course, times when barriers just arise because we don't know what we're doing. But that all feeds back sort of, not to sound like a broken record, right? But wage compression, right? What we're talking about often, whether it's access to SNAP or EITC, we're often talking about distributing income in ways that lift people at the bottom, and that has to come from somewhere, and often folks like me are trying to get it from folks at the top. And so it just creates this dynamic that is, nice it is to redesign programs. We are living in a society where there is a little bit of a competition over the spoils. Just an observation. Dark one. Sorry.
I think Sacha Baron Cohen had this in his proposal to Bernie Sanders.
And frankly, as I listened to everything, I kept thinking, we don't have the political will to do any of this. You're in New York, where there was the political will to do it, at least at the state level. We've heard a very diplomatic description of the political scene in Pennsylvania. Right. That I'll be long dead before they actually have the political will to do some of the things that you're saying. So I'm kind of on the dark side also. That's why we're on the side. The sun is setting, so it's probably time to.
That's the dark side of the moon. Okay, we actually have talked through our break, but we have this room till 4. It says on your agenda 3:45, so this was built in to the afternoon. Why don't we take a 15-minute break, come back, and then Sarah, we're doing methodological challenges, right? Okay. 3 o'clock.
Last session will be a discussion, however long it lasts.
It's no presentations.
It'll just be.
You're not going to summarize the whole
Yes.
Oh, right. Oh, right.
The explosion They got
He lives in a box and he yeah, right.
So we figure out the 167 Southwest
Oh, yeah.
We don't need that anymore. I actually put a proposal right in. And I don't know if it's just
We do. They turned it around. They were on the ropes. I keep waiting for this. I'd like to start again. I just don't want to be started. Yeah, right. Technically, they should be far away from any sort of other measurement.
That is
Go for the money, yeah. Okay, that's good. All right.
Time for a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
That's because I was asleep.
So his thing is not really money. And then, and then Lisa, I don't know what that might be a way to ask it, and then we'll make sure that that's around that. We'll share people would just, that's what I'm thinking. If you don't have, you to now do that, people are, which is great. Like, they would love to hear energy reactions, physical. It builds a lot of value.
Yeah.
So people are getting
So this is a lot of folks that have
that's why
And so, well, especially since there should be more
I would say I have time to do that.
well, unless
even if the whole thing doesn't driverless cars, I have technology, even though it's on the front piece of paper.
I mean, I was
Even people who are doing that technology, they have this attitude. So mass transportation issues will never
unless
but
like somebody, so I searched it right now. Yeah. I hate calling it hey, bingo.
Yeah.
As long as they have children, it's going to be
But even in that, I don't care how much.
they have a machine, but they're the ones doing it. There's not a machine. It's so it doesn't that is so cool.
So our issue
I was just like, you're not getting in trouble. We're doing that. Yeah. Hey, yes. Have you been following us?
I started saying when I was like, no, so great, thanks.
What's these institution costs? How you doing? I'm tired. I'm alright. It must be half the value of one. Yes. So we're going to do all
At the end, make sure we get a dinner, and then we get
wanting to spend the
back to right. And then the box will go tomorrow, and then take the bag.
here, and I think that will for us the point where we can move what I have in tomorrow's talk into the last day of we have now, along with this. I think I want fewer things for tomorrow than I just say.
Yeah.
And so we will adjust right now.
Okay.
Once
No, I can't find it. I think it's just box. All I know is you put plastic down anywhere.
I believe it would be cheaper.
Or a plastic container. No. Yeah, no, he was fully focused, but he has so far. I mean, I like this where we got him, you couldn't anything, you know. Something, I mean, now actually right in the Sandy called this check because you know, I just wanted to say hi.
Hey, how are you, Lisa?
Good, how are you?
Oh, I'm trying.
Like this. Oh, I mean, I just I thought like that.
my sister had to go back into bulldogs. I love other animals.
You must be like I found it all off.
No.
Part of would be no job there if there wasn't a way to make it. Don't worry about right? So what have we thought about that?
Expropriating appropriators, I think is the phrase you like to
Settle for like some old Catholic social democratic ways of representation.
What's
I lost everybody. The funniest thing is apparently they're now lovers.
we can't go back up, right? There's no conversation about
No, I'm from my I just didn't my plane.
Oh,
We're gonna start us, right? Okay.
I love the English.
All right, everyone.
Yeah.
I'll round them up. All right, we're gonna start. So, our last session is really, we thought of as an opportunity for us to have a discussion while we're all here together about some of the methodological, I don't know what we called it, challenges and opportunities with this kind of work. And I mean, today has been so fascinating, and I heard it throughout the day, all these different kinds of methods that are being used to study these issues of the effects of wage changes and other policy supports for low-wage workers and all these different kinds of things we can do. And we've heard about studies using administrative data, surveys of workers, surveys of employers, these policy simulations of what happens, you know, what the effects might be if we enacted different policies. We've heard about qualitative in-depth interviews. We heard some, you know, in Seattle where they're looking also at effects on prices of these kinds of changes. So we've heard about so many different kinds of methods. It's also been really exciting to me to have people from so many different disciplines here together and to think about what perspectives
that we all bring, thinking about things in different ways, and even listening to people who might be located in one specific discipline but are trying to bring in other perspectives to their work. And I'm thinking about, you know, Audrey being in a business school but trying to bring in some of this social responsibility framework that is stuff that we talk a lot about in social work, I think, in some ways. And then I think the other part that's really exciting is that our conversation is going beyond sort of just what's happening in universities, and we want to really highlight, like, what does it mean to collaborate with our partners outside of university, like Lisa and everyone from the union, in thinking about working together to make this research the most fruitful and useful that it can be. You know, policy think tanks that are trying to inform these debates in ways that might use a broader vision than sometimes we have in the academy. So I feel like there's so much we can talk about. I think we were really envisioning this last session as a chance to kind of think methodologically and maybe hear from a lot of the people who have spoken already about their studies, about what some of the methodological challenges have been, as well as opportunities, so that we can collaborate on thinking about ways to address those challenges. I think we can follow up on other issues that have come up, but we don't have anyone scheduled to present, so I'm counting on you all to.
So one of the,
yeah.
I like what you mentioned in our case, the partnership or collaboration we have with the union. And on the one hand, that's been really, really positive. The challenge for, on the other hand, because if we have one hand, we have another. The challenge for us is balancing that relationship with the view that we are not actually a tool for the union, which has been expressed to us as a group already. That we, and I think that's kind of delicate balance. That in fact, being clear that yes, there are people we're working with, but the results are what the results are, and then we will interpret it as through our eyes, whatever our eyes are. We know that our eyes as a group collectively lean closer to one view of the world than another. But it's challenging. One of our main findings through that atlas is to say, look, you know, you guys have to demonstrate at the same time this collaboration and degree of independence. And so I've heard that out of other folks see this as problematic, have ideas. And I will say one of the reasons why we didn't want to use the name of the location from where the is that we sort of made a commitment to them, we means that whenever we were going to be reporting in a public forum findings, so we let them know before, and they were kind of comfortable with that. We didn't want to be a partner, they at least wanted to know that. They wanted to know us. So I put that as kind of a challenge that we face in Pittsburgh.
A challenge in terms of reception to your findings, or in terms of, okay, so not necessarily on the ground with the people that you're, or with the people that you're interviewing. It's more about reception.
And we're pretty engaged with trying to use our data not just for just my lesson. Right. I mean, collectively, we've all made the decision that we'll try to inform policy. And this certainly came up when we were doing a press conference, right? So in the mayor's suite about what we had learned after that. And then that response sort of came back to us about, from our final thunder, about how we need to ensure that we're seeing also as an independent source.
But on the other hand, like to Sophie's question, we wouldn't have been able to do this research if we weren't partnering with the union, and that's why we wanted to do it to be useful. I'm just, I know you know that. I'm just saying, like, but I mean, even the credibility with workers and their willingness to seek with us, right? At least for many of them, is based on the fact that they know, like,
We have a sanction.
yeah,
From the union.
right? That we're not these sort of out, I mean, we are these outside people, but we're not these completely separate outside people who are coming to just like grab the data and run, but like we're working in collaboration.
Just two things. But one, in terms of usefulness, when we used it for bargaining, we used it to open bargaining. I mean, it was tremendously helpful. It had an absolute material effect on what was achieved in bargaining. You know, on the subject of like workers and researchers, I mean, you know, it really does depend a lot on, you know, who workers are or where they're absent. But there is a belief among, I would say, low-wage workers, but particularly Black workers, that this is how the world works, that we experience trauma and pain, and educated, mostly white people, write books about it and get really big salaries. And how come we don't get the money? Like there's a little bit of feeling, and it's something that, no, it's something that the fact that you provided incentives for people to participate was really, really meaningful. And I know, you know, from one point of view, that's just like, oh well, it's people's time, and it's just another version of getting paid, right? It does buy people's time, or it does provide that incentive, but in the context of that narrative around exploitation and who suffers and then whose stories are kind of monetized and tenurized, it made a huge difference that there was a little bit of respect being shown.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and because it's showing, yeah, that we value their time, but one of the things we talked a lot about also in training the interviewers for the in-depth interviews is also like, I think we tend to go into that situation as an interviewer like, I'm getting something from you, and of course we are, but something that's been my experience over many, many years of doing these kind of interviews, often with like, you know, in many different contexts, but workers who are low wage, like I've interviewed a lot of people who work in juvenile justice institutions, let's say like line workers, same kind of thing, right? That not that many people ask them about their stories and about what matters to them and what their work and jobs mean to them. And it's been my experience that even separate from the pay or on top of that, that can be, like many people have thanked me after an interview, like, oh, I really enjoyed that. That's been, and I think it's just because, especially when we're talking about work, that they aren't often seen as like workers in the same or important kind of, like their work as important in the same ways that, you know, they see more privileged people being asked about their perspective.
I think it also helps, you know, or just in addition, I think it's really helpful that we have material ways from the beginning, like even this 2-day symposium of having something community oriented tomorrow, particularly, that it helps to be able to tell someone that we're going to do that we are in material, like in clear ways, that we aren't running away, we're going to stay and try to help. You know, I just think that makes a huge difference then, from a social work perspective of trying to avoid those sort of long-standing research integrity violations. I think it's really important.
Have you guys, and it may be early, so I apologize for asking the question, have you guys as a group begun to think about where your policy sort of, your final chapter will be in terms of what you're going to recommend, or where you're leaning in terms of talking about the study and the results?
It's a good question. I don't think we've had that in its fullest as a conversation. I can't speak to the group. I think we're so overwhelmed by the amount of data that we have right now that we gather again. But sometimes we forget that there's it's days like tomorrow that reminds us that there's some life to do what we do. Not that having you here this morning, but also reason about why we do what we do. But tomorrow really is kind of that reminder. So yeah, I don't know that we're there yet for where this end will take us.
Well, because we're just starting wave 2 of like 3 waves of data collection.
Just one with the security guard.
Yeah, and even wave 1 with another population. And so I think even just how many like in-depth interviews have we done for wave 2 now? 10, 11. But even just
So we're not that far into that, but like already the value of that has been kind of incredible to be able, because what we've been doing is reading so we're trying to interview all the same people. We won't get quite all of them, and we may add a few new people, and some people are no longer working at the hospital, so we're just kind of doing a quick phone interview with them. But, you know, at the interviewers, we are reading the transcript from the previous year first and reading the field notes and memos that the interviewers wrote from last year. And so going in and being able to start the conversation in a really different place and being able to kind of follow up on how things were going the year before and getting so much new insight in there.
So I think we're also kind of thinking about it as we move forward. And I'll give one example where this is actually sitting in a meeting with Lisa and some other union folks. We sort of confirmed something that they thought and said, oh, we could do something about it. I don't know if you've done that or not, so now be explicit. We were shocked by the low utilization of public benefits. We just told us it was far lower than we anticipated. It was far lower than what the research kind of indicated that we might encounter. And so we talked about that with union folks, and so they were already thinking about this too, as having a benefit, what you guys call it, a benefit navigator or something that could actually help workers navigate the things that you folks are pointing out as barriers to easily doing it. So sometimes some of the things are just organically happening, but I don't know. So I don't know.
Specifically, what benefits did you see kind of a deficit?
Pick Livy was shockingly low.
I think the ITC
was beyond low, and this is a community that's really worked hard to get the ITC. I was making a little note that I want folks from Just Harvest to talk to because they actually go out trying to get workers to sign up to use the ITC. The ITC was low. I mean, there's the rates that you were saying, okay, this is the intransigent group. That's not what we were seeing as the participant group.
We were talking about this a little bit earlier. Like one frustration that I have in working with government agencies, either at the state and the federal level, is that there's so little coordination. That we're trying to run some field experiments on unemployment search behavior, and the frustration is that the local state agencies and workforce agencies just don't have access to the administrative wage records, and more generally, if you talk to the CMS and HHS about the ACA, as we were mentioning, I think the CMS does such a good job in terms of giving personal attention to individuals who are not, signing up for health insurance or not taking up their supplementary ACA benefits. But we don't have that same sort of concierge service for these other benefit programs, and every benefit program works in isolation. Some define what it is to be independent differently from others, and it's really unfortunate that there's not more coordination across federal programs, federal and state.
Jeff and I were just talking about this. I think there's the sort of hassle factor, and there's just, you think about this sort of Brazil factor, right? There's just too much bureaucracy but I think there is also the I don't know how to describe it. Maybe it is the concierge thing. I mean, what people say is that, okay, I already know what's going to happen if I go down there. That's the way the conversation always starts. I know it's down there. Down there is always the place that you go. You go down there. No, I need it, right? And it's kind of like hell, kind of down there. And it's a shitty office, right? And you're going to have to transfer 2 buses, and you're going to show up with the wrong paperwork, and they're not going to say, let me, blast through this obstacle for you. They're going to say, go home and come back another day. And I think people are just so, there's a such learned discouragement about it. I think there's just decades of anger about being treated like that we actually have to overcome. It was a question I had for you. Have you ever tried to do this with groups of people rather than one at a time?
In what sense? Like,
well, sometimes when we have folks where you've got like a cultural obstacle to overcome that people seeing other people doing it, or like everybody's doing it, like we try to create a like everybody's doing it atmosphere, and I wonder if they're, because people will do things that everybody's doing it, right?
Except our surveys.
Social proof is, I think, there's this powerful belief that social proof can. So if you convince people that everyone else is doing it, so we actually one of the tax forms that we randomized to these thousands of Californians was a form that said this was the language that they allowed us to use. So it wasn't a perfect implementation, but 4 out of 5 eligible people claim this credit. So we're trying to test this idea that everyone's doing it. You should do it too. I mean, we found actually adverse effects, so take that one down. But I think it was just we added to the confusion of what that form was trying to do. But in other contexts, people have found like varying results of these social proof strategies and normal strategies. So the UK government has used it to good effect. Like other people are paying their taxes on time, so they see increases in.
But you get that mailed like just to yourself in your own. I mean, like go to the back of a church or go to like a place where people, like a congregate setting, and say, hey, let's all sign up for our income tax credit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would certainly help. Like what you said just resonated really strongly. Like one anecdote, we're working again with the ACPTS, the pretrial services here in Allegheny County, and so we were going to run all these clever, we thought, randomized trials, and I wanted to give some people, free Uber rides to get to their arraignments because, there's like 20% of people just don't show up, and that's very costly for them, and they have to show up eventually. So we were looking at the data, and it was remarkable that there's essentially conditional randomization of when you get scheduled. So you either get scheduled in the morning or afternoon, and then 3 or 4 days a week. And so just by looking at the data, you can see that people who are scheduled on Monday mornings have such a high rate of non-compliance. People in the afternoons do a lot better. Like Wednesday afternoon, they do great. And so these are first-order differences. And it's such a big problem, and it just suggests the role of these hassles, and you start the work day or you can't procure like childcare at certain times of the day. So moving everything to the afternoon is probably difficult logistically, but those are like first order considerations that I think are kind of off the radar.
Night hours, like if any benefits offices have evening hours, things would change a lot.
Right. I mean, this is not related to methodology, but I'm just thinking of some of the interviews I've done this week, and 2 are sticking out that people who are not saving for retirement at all, and also are not signing up for health insurance because they don't know how to make the decision.
Yeah.
And I was talking to one person, and he was just like, I'll get to it. And this man is 49. Yeah. I'll get to it.
For health insurance or retirement?
Either. This person was enrolled in neither. And
well, hopefully they didn't start this morning.
Yeah, and it was just clear that this was a person through the interview that may not have had the greatest cognitive abilities, the greatest reading abilities, and needed something like someone to sit down and. I'm not saying he needed it. He might not have wanted it, but if it was available, is it possible that he would have had somebody go through? Because health insurance in particular is so complicated to understand, and there's all this jargon, and and it's difficult when you're a social worker doing the interview. And I did follow up with him and just said, if you need help, I don't know how much I could provide, but I might be able to help you find someone who could. But there's also this, like, if it was from somewhere that people were familiar with, that they trusted, that they felt was on their side, I think it would just go a lot farther than, you know, a random person you don't know. Like, would you like help me with that? That's just not, you know, that's, you don't have that relationship that people really need to ask for help, because asking for help when you're a 49-year-old man is not, you know, of me. You know, I wasn't surprised. It wasn't something that,
and those decision contexts are so ridden with anxiety. And I mean, so this is not a huge kind of, I think, topic in economics, and I think we've kind of missed it, or I think we're missing an important kind of this factor in a lot of these financial decisions, but the role of anxiety. And like I'm starting to do now some studies where we have people meditate, or we can calm them through, you know, Apple and breathing apps, or we fight anxiety a little bit, but like by watching a video of a wine glass kind of as you presentation. And then you make insurance choices or retirement savings decisions. Now these are all kind of hypothetical, but I do think that that's kind of the direction where some of like AIG in particular, and another firm I work with, they're actually open to this idea that if you help people kind of relax and reduce their stress, only then will they be ready to engage like some of these tougher financial planning problems. And that's exacerbated, I think, by the fact that, you know, 60% of households have less than $1,000 of emergency liquidity on hand. Yeah, and those things are really, to the methodological point, they're so difficult. It's so difficult to run like a field experiment where you manipulate financial anxiety and look to see its impacts in terms of like more general financial decisions. But
one way might be to send them many letters. That's actually what I heard from these two people. Was I just keep getting letters about that, and I'm imagining this pile of letters.
Very funny.
You know, that go unread because they're too complicated to understand, or there are too many variables.
Or because the only way to function, right? I mean, there is like, I remember having this conversation because one of the things we learned is that there is no hospital worker who's below the level of a nurse, and even the nurses, right, who has any hope of retiring. And any hope of retiring. Their Social Security is going to be crap, their whatever. And it's like, it's not something you can fix. And so just to have people talk to you about it is a bad day. Because what you're trying to do all day is just, you know, park that so that you can go home and cook dinner or do whatever you're going to do, because there's nothing you can do about it, because you have, you know, your 401k, you can't possibly catch up. You know, so I think the role of anxiety in how people navigate their day is like, it's a huge factor in what is making people behave the ways in which they behave. But that's why I actually had a couple conversations with people about it. It's like, oh, I see this whole stack of letters. Like, what are they doing there? When people will open up about it, it's like, I'm afraid to open them because they're going to tell me to do something I can't do. So what's the point?
Unfortunately, they're, the reasons, I mean, they are giving up. So the matching incentives are critical, right? I mean, there's tax advantages to the 401k, but, you know, 80% of firms that offer 401ks offer matches, and usually those are pretty generous. And so it quite literally is such a good deal. And I think, like, economists, that's what puzzles them. And so I'm trying to get a few firms to test what I call like the Serenity account. And the idea would be to have your automatic 401k kind of contributions not just go to this lockbox where you can take out money without like these huge penalties. And a lot of people do that. So they end up really cannibalizing their retirement savings by this leakage. But have it first go to like this transitionary kind of Serenity account that kind of gives you 2 or 3 months of a buffer. And then from there, it would automatically transition to your 401k. And I kind of think that's the way the industry is sort of moving. Like Prudential came out with a product. It doesn't have as nice of a name as the one I was suggesting, but they came out with like a workplace emergency savings program that was layered on top of the 401k. But unfortunately, they're so hard to study.
What is the point of the serenity period? Because your money's still gone, right?
No,
It's like that.
you can get it. It's not
Oh,
in,
you
it's not
can
in the
still
account
get-
yet.
Oh, okay, so you can still draw on it if there were that emergency.
You can draw on it without penalty. I mean, it doesn't get to, I think, we say you're concerned about the, some people just can't afford this 4% draw.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
You can't even pay your bills on the income you have, and of course you're not going to be taking advantage of it.
Well, or I mean, it's a really critical problem to solve, and I don't know that there's a way to solve it short of a pretty substantial transfer, from haves to have-nots. I mean, at some point,
Or serenity account.
that is, and so I think there are the kind of gizmos in between that will help people who can do that.
Yeah.
But I think for people who can't, even the notion that it's a good deal just makes it worse, because what kind of person am I that there's a deal? I mean, in this society where our president makes deals and like the ability to make a deal is like but it's like a thing, right? It's a constituent of your masculine. I'm not even shitting you. It's like there you've got losers and you've got people who can make good deals. And here's a good deal. And no, I'm not joking. And I can't make it. It just makes people feel terrible. The presence of the 401k for people who can't do it, it's not viewed as a benefit.
Yeah.
It's viewed as a constant reminder that you don't have your act together.
So Lisa, that is at odds with this remarkable evidence that we have on defaults, right? So I think that's maybe the big triumph of, I mean, I give credit to behavioral economics for anything closely related, but I think that's, the thing that we keep going back to is this idea that over the last 25 years, defaults have become this pervasive feature of 401k plans, and it's raised participation from 40% to 80% on average. And so those people are not opting out there, and particularly amongst younger workers and minority workers who wouldn't otherwise participate under these default machines, they are participating. Just automatic enrollment.
You gotta opt out.
Oh,
Right.
Yeah, sorry. So when you're first hired at a firm, usually the defaults are low, they're at 3%. The match is up to 6% typically, so they're not fully taking advantage of all the money on the table. But it's not as if they're opting out. So they are adjusting. Like, we have some new data to suggest that some people are not even aware of whether or not they're
Which I think is actually tremendous.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, why
It
call
suggests that they
it?
have-
Yeah. Why call it that? Why not just say this is your wage and we put 3% in your retirement? Just do it that way and let people bargain up from there.
Right.
It would be
Yeah.
psychologically so much easier for people, but it also lets people look at, and then people can go and complain about their wages.
Right.
And then it's not like, well, we gave you a good wage, but now we're also doing this. It does set the conversation in a place that I think is psychologically easier and also empowering for people.
Right.
Just call it a benefit. It's a benefit. This is your retirement fund. We put it in, not we give you this much and then we take it back out.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
So offset the wages by
Oh, not.
the third bit, yeah.
or don't offset the wages, or do that. That's what I'm saying. At some point, you got to transfer some damn wealth. Like, if employers can't attract people at $12 or $13 plus you get 3% in your retirement, then they're going to have to attract people at this in your 3% of retirement. For workers, that is a much better arrangement.
Right. And to be fair, these are mainly programs that target full-time workers, so there's still a lot of people left out.
Yeah. And anyway,
I would also, or were you going to say something? I would love to hear a little more from Sophie about the simulations. I think that's such an interesting methodological tool that you all are engaged in.
Yeah. So it was really interesting. I mean, there's obviously a large discussion around the minimum wage, and we decided, okay, this is something we should simulate. The first problem we encountered and one would encounter when looking at national data and trying to understand the impacts of minimum wage is what happens when you actually calculate wages in the current population survey. On the ASIC, like the March survey where you get poverty rates, you have some wages that are very low and below the statutory wage. So you have error, and it's something you have to account for. We set a threshold that we weren't going to accept wages below a certain level of $5 as legitimate, or we decided they were unaffected. So we didn't necessarily eliminate them, but we didn't subject them to the wage increase. But it also, it's something that comes up, and also because you have to calculate wages in the CPS, but you also would have to do so in the ACS, and even more difficult there because they don't have hours worked. It's a bin of hours. So that was our first challenge. We decided to be on the conservative end and not include certain wages. And then we applied this employment effect. So we raised wages and then applied a kind of spillover effect and adjusted wages so that their ratio to the current prevailing wage was the same ratio after the wage. Right? So if you were making $16 relative to if you were making $15 relative to $7.25, we kind of adjusted for those so that you would still be making more than a $15 wage worker after the wage hike. So the difference in wages for the ripple or upward spillover effect. There was it's like I remember writing the word spillover 10 times in a paragraph to describe different things, and it's like I gotta think of a better word than this. So ripple is good. So we did that, and then used the CBO's methods to adjust for employment. And what's actually really interesting about their methodology is they take an employment elasticity that's in the literature and adjust it based on the portion of workers that are affected by the wage hike. So if in the literature, there's an employment elasticity of 6% or so, 0.06, you figure out what that effect is for the actual workers affected, because that 0.06 is for the entire population. So what would it be for the actual workers? So we did that. And then kind of applied that effect by state. And then the rest of the simulation. It was really interesting. It was what I found actually the most interesting is that most wages were above $10 an hour. So about 75% of wages in this directly affected group were for wage earners earning between $10 and $15 an hour. So the employment effect we expected, because we used a high employment elasticity to kind of say that we were addressing this issue. It wasn't as detrimental because most people were getting a really small wage. Most people weren't getting a 200% wage. They were getting on average about a 35% raise. So those are some little details. I don't know if anything's any more questions, but it was a really interesting thing to figure out how to model.
Maybe you guys. Just quick, I was on something and heard this story on the way over, so I have to ask.
Yeah.
How do they treat listening data?
In the CPS.
And I will tell the story while you do that.
So
go ahead.
But I think it's I think they use the hot education, and I should put it in control, figure out a way to control computation. The other thing is that we used a CPS file that we don't have corrections for underreporting of benefits in. The Urban Institute does the trim adjustment, and so once we use a year where we have that adjustment, or not missing data, but an underreporting issue might definitely change our results. But yeah, that's how they do it.
Because and this is the story I was telling you. I used to survey income and summation of my dissertation, I used automated weights, and then used a cross-sectional high-tech approach to compute data and compute incomes as well as data. And they actually indicated you could determine which incomes were based on actual reports and which were imputed. And when I was able to use imputations as control data, so I learned that the way older adults escape poverty is to make up an income. It was imputation is actually a statistically significant way of escaping poverty. And the high-tech approach is basically to pick a set of characteristics and find someone else in your data who has those characteristics. Now, it's not, that's the most simplistic way to describe it. It's a bit more complex than that. And so they're essentially taking someone else's report and putting it in for that one. Because they didn't allow any missing data.
Is this set based on in-person interviews?
Yes. And the data set that I used, they were every 3 months. And so they would get, it would be every 3 months, yeah, every 3 months, I think. The current month and the past 3 months.
So I have one question for Sophie. Have you guys used these simulations to try to predict some of the outcomes of natural experiments that are going on like in Seattle and then obviously here?
Like hours or like
just to like validate your
yeah, so we haven't tried to predict individual response to the wage change. So it's been more on the simplistic side of like changing income in the way that the income is outlined to change, as opposed to like how we were just like how might your benefit calculation might change, but how might you choose not to even take up benefits because your credit limit has become so low. Same, you can see multiple different outcomes of the ITC. So we haven't integrated any specific behavioral responses in that way, or on the side of employers beyond just job cuts. So it would be really interesting to figure out how to think through how to do that, and some of the less obvious ways in which jobs are, the nature of work changes, given the available data.
Yeah, I guess the data would be hard to observe.
Yeah. But we are in a separate project that's following New Yorkers and trying to monitor the change of the wage in New York, and that data set comes with a lot of other indicators like changes in material hardship, changes in behavior in terms of child care, changes in medical expenditures. So we'll eventually be able to say a lot more about New York wage changes to other factors around employment and like well-being.
So Sophie, your first layer of analysis is the U.S.
Yeah.
And then you're going to do just New York?
No.
Or you're going to do...
Sorry, I just but okay, so we have this kind of national project where you mainly use the CPS and look at CPS. We also, for now, 4 years have been following a representative sample of New Yorkers. The first cohort was about 2,000 New Yorkers, and now we have 4,000 New Yorkers, and we interview them quarterly about a number of different things, but we get, for example, assets, debts, health, but more importantly, we get an annual survey where we measure poverty, material hardship, and health. And so we're able to measure poverty in New York City under the supplemental poverty measure. It's also able to measure material hardships and all of the ones that were discussed earlier, as well as kind of a general health measure. And then between those annual surveys, we have these smaller surveys, topical surveys on asset, debts, employment, consumption, health. So it's a lot of data, and it just happens to be collected at the same time as the wage went up. So now we're going to extend that panel to 4 years, followed for 4 years, and kind of monitor how the wage increase is interacting with these other factors that relate to well-being.
Wow, that'll be neat.
Yeah, that'll be really
because
cool.
you, if I heard that correctly, that
Yeah.
means you're going to be able to compare your simulation results to
actual,
actual.
yeah, and you know, understand a lot of other changes in well-being for workforce.
And when you said it's a representative sample of New Yorkers, so it's across income or it's low income?
Yeah, it's cross income all 5 boroughs. And the first panel is publicly available, so I can give anybody the information to access it. But yeah, so that's with support from the Robert Foundation, so we can review with them on this project.
Thinking about this question about how are you getting to evaluate their budget, assets, all those things.
So, well, I can send the asset questionnaire. Like it's how they, I guess, yeah, the relationship to their finances. I don't know how much we are separating like actual their reporting on their financial budgets compared to like their feelings about the budgets. But that's kind of what I remember from the question. But
just as far as like the legitimacy of what people know about their budgets.
Well, yeah, I think, and what they know about their own income. Yeah. Also, I think because we do collect, to measure poverty under this measure, you have to ask about so many different types of income. So you introduce more error with every kind of type of income. So that's been tricky. But I'd say what's a next thing that you guys do as well is that, and we do it in-house. So our surveyors have like a pretty close relationship with the people that they're interviewing, and we have a high response rate, and we're a bit more. That gives us more confidence in the data. But I think that's.
Yeah, because I think getting back to your sort of attitudinal sort of piece of stress for our workers, like I was talking to Sarah about this the other day, that just, I don't know, when you don't have enough money to make it all the way to the end of the month,
Right.
It's not fun to budget. I mean, it's sort of fun to budget when you get a little extra money and you can buy something you want. It's not fun when you're scraping by, and so, you know, I think that, you know, I don't want it to come off like, oh, those people don't know how to budget, or like,
Right.
you know, that's not how
Right.
I mean it. But, you know, that it's like, it's just hard to know and down to a penny, depending on how people, you know, people have all different ways that they get to the end of the month. And some people budget, and a lot of people we talk to just say, I start with the first bill that comes out, and then I do the second bill, and then I do the third bill, and then whatever I have left is what I have left. Right? So it's you know, how much do you spend on groceries? Well, you know, it's sort of dependent on these other things that sometimes are the same and sometimes change.
And we have this like draconian data from SNAP recipients. I think it's called the calorie crunch, right? This idea that at the end of the month you see these adverse outcomes with respect to, I mean, calorie consumption, but it leads to adverse health outcomes and adverse like outcomes for child nutrition.
We used to talk about that at school at the end of the month. Because the teachers were stressed because they were at the end of the month, and the parents were stressed because they were at the end of the month, and the kids were stressed because they were running out of food, and our whole school was just, you know, the end of the month was just rough. I worked at Untitled High School, and so it's just, you know, this pattern of trying to like,
Nobody takes their meds.
Yeah. No. Everybody does.
You can't afford it.
First, businesses go on the last 2 days of the month. Sad benefits go down.
Sophie, I'm going to say this, and I'll hate myself forever that I said it, because it's the worst thing for me to ever do is to suggest people do more work.
Oh.
So you just let it go right over your head. The CBO analysis actually has a range, right? So they have zero employment effects, they have 500,000, they have 1 million.
Yeah.
In anticipation of your future results,
Yeah.
if you could generate estimates, your poverty estimates in that same range, so we can
Maybe comparable.
judge
Yes.
who was right.
Definitely. And that's definitely. Well,
I apologize.
no, that's actually not that much work. It's not doing
As
something.
soon as you get the finding, it goes straight to mine.
No, I don't want to know what the answer is. I'll be full of anxiety for weeks.
Well, good.
Sean Spicer told us not to read the CPM results. So, Sophie, I mean, not to pick on the spot, but are you guys trying to essentially create like a hedonic poverty line? Like, I mean, this really resonates in the sense of, are you trying to find, I mean, with your data, it sounds like you'll be able to see whether or not what we think of as like the federal poverty line kind of is associated with a baseline level of kind of non-anxiety or well-being.
Some argument.
Yeah.
So it was the supplemental number was developed by Census and the Department of Labor Statistics. So we use it because you can evaluate the programs with it as opposed to the official measure. Like so it's
The well-being measures are.
Oh, I thought you meant like this. Yeah, I wonder, it's like, or are we trying to, I think our view is that there are multiple different ways in which people experience frustrations and disadvantage. Some of them are overlapping and some of them are not. And so to understand a city and what's happening in it, you need kind of all that full picture, because you might be able to totally get by, but your health is horrific. And that's one thing, you know, policymakers should know, but also a lot of wealthier people can't get by financially because of a number of other factors. So we developed it to look at these, or not we developed, I didn't develop, but like I see it used as kind of a broader picture of understanding well-being across multiple fronts.
Well, and I think it speaks to kind of these big questions about that we've been kind of talking about all day about what does it all mean, right? Like when we even think about reducing poverty, for example, even that is a means to an end, at least from a social worker's perspective of supporting people to have overall well-being in their lives, right? And I think that's partly what gets left off sometimes from the conversation. There's a movie that I show in class called What's the Economy For Anyway? It's in this documentary, but, you know, and that's also in a more global perspective, thinking about the U.S. compared with other countries that in many ways do support overall well-being and aren't just thinking in economic terms. But it, you know, I guess, I hope that some of the value of having a kind of multidisciplinary perspective on some of those things is giving people also who, again, often don't have the opportunity, like we're so focused for low-income people on getting them to this poverty line, which is arbitrary anyway. But we're not thinking about like the overall totality of their lives.
It's you know, I think some of the things that we heard that were, you know, what like paycheck to paycheck is a different problem than I can't pay my bills, right? I mean, they're not unrelated because they all reducible on some level to your income or your whatever. But you know, paycheck to paycheck is I'm not going to invest because I don't know what's going to happen 3 months from now, and that's one kind of anxiety, is future anxiety, anxiety about the future, not being able to pay the bills. You know, brings in a whole other host of, you know, horsemen of the apocalypse, you know, the bill collectors and the, and, you know, and what am I trying to say? I mean, you could, like some of the anti-poverty strategies, I think, are more interesting than others, even if they don't cost more money, because they go at some of the, you know, income issues, right? It's why universal basic anything is as good as a raise, I think, in some ways, in a way that food stamps is not as good as a raise. They're not all targeted at the same discomfort people feel as a human being when it's not well-being, you know what I mean? So I think that's really important. I think it's really important that, I think there is some degree to which people want a little bit, it's no different than what firms want, right? They want a little bit of predictability. They want a little bit of, enough understanding of how the money works and enough guarantee of a certain kind of income flow to be able to think through investment decisions, and all of that just telescopes for folks. And so I think one of the things that we have to work on is not just, here's a better raise here, or here's a better benefit there, or here's a kind of set of expectations that people can have because of the policies that we have that allows people to think, well, I have some reasonable expectation that I'm going to be okay in my lifetime. And on some level, I think it's that simple, but also that hard to make happen. It's very hard to make happen.
And I think that is so, just thinking about stories from our data is that we're so far from that. And, I'm really struck by how frequently people talk about macroeconomic, that not only do they individually know they have to figure out how to survive, and that they individually know that there's going to be unpredictability because your car breaks down or your, roof leaks or whatever, but also that they cannot predict what is coming in the economy, and that they're trying to calculate these impossible trade-offs of, if we collectively bargain for this, and fast food workers collectively bargain for that, and then who's going to be paying more for food, or who's going to be, I don't know, and it's just the commonality that is coming up as we talk to people makes it seem to me that it's a really surface, it's really at the front of people's minds, because, you talk to somebody for 45 minutes and it comes up for most people, then you start to be worried that, or you're not worried, but you recognize that as a real worry, and so I think it's so many levels of unpredictability. I don't know, it's just concerning.
Guys, do you know? Oh, sorry.
No, as I listen, and especially sort of listening to Audrey earlier, and you'll have to forgive me, this is not a well-formulated question in my mind, because I'm just sort of trying to think of what it means. What are the outcomes that we really want to be looking at? We say we're interested in well-being, and there's individual well-being, there's family well-being. We have some very standard measures that we tend to fall back on. And often it's things that are very easy to quantify. But are we capturing, what are the dimensions really that we really want to make sure that we capture when we talk about raising wages? Because we're raising wages perhaps to foster well-being, both for individuals, families, and for communities. It could be quantitative, it could be qualitative, but are we really capturing all of the nuances of what we need? And are there things that we should be looking at that we're not? So that's sort of taking it in a different direction.
I'm sorry. Remember when we went to that thing with those Scottish guys, and they found the Royal, where they found this Royal Arts and Science, I can't remember. It's a, but you know what I mean? No, it's called, got arts in it. I don't even know. I have no idea how you landed there or how we landed there. But we found ourselves in this room. I don't know how I got there. But yeah, but it was, and they're doing like the research I remember. So they were doing this really interesting research. And they're trying to get at exactly this question: what is well-being? And they're running a bunch of experiments in different parts of Scotland. Some of them have UBI, and then some of them they just give money to communities and some coaching, and they do all this stuff. But the dimension that they really focus on that was really interesting to me is like straight up power. like just straight up power, that they feel like if you invest in people's power, you get all kinds of multiplier effects that are really interesting. And they also did some research where they interviewed people and they asked them, do you have the ability to influence this situation, a whole, right? And they kind of scored people, and then they asked people, do you know anybody who can? A lot of people said no. A lot of people who are poor or otherwise struggling said no, they don't. And they found like really tight correlations between whether or not you knew anybody or were yourself an influencer. Like not knowing anybody who can fix something. I don't have money, my car breaks down. Do I know anybody who can fix it? Has the health equivalent, like straight up freaking health equivalent of a pack and a half of cigarettes a day. You know, and so they're trying to cut into the problem by developing influence. Some of it can be about money, some of it could be about your union, some of it could be about, you know, jail vote, some of it could be, but that's what they think you have to fix. It was really, and it's really fascinating. Like the work is really, really fascinating. I found it.
I actually have to interrupt here because we're at 4 o'clock. We can continue this at dinner. If we could get a count on who would be going to dinner.
Can I say one thing real quick?
If you can do it in less than a minute.
Yes, yes.
Because
So,
this goes
the
off
one
and
challenge
on.
that we didn't, and I wanted to jump in like a long time ago, but the conversation was flowing and I don't like to be that person. But we didn't talk a lot about translation. Like how do you move this stuff and how do we talk across disciplines? Economists confuse me quite a bit. Simulations confuse me. I mean, so how do we translate across disciplines? Because I don't think we're doing enough interdisciplinary work on these issues. We're doing some, but not enough of it. But also, how do we move it to inform stakeholders? How do we move it to policymakers? I know Mark, he goes to the legislature and works on his, you know, but how are we translating this stuff? And again, it's not a question, it's just something that we really need to